Let us visualize the Father, immutable in the bosom of his eternity. Let us visualize the prodigious descent of the sun through the zodiacs and innumerable spheres. From the ecstatic angels and gods on their knees, to the adoration of unknown races, to the terror of stupefied demons. Let us also visualize the spirit who followed the sun, how his subtle wake becomes wider and deeper in proportion to the new martyrdoms that Jesus accepts as he gives more affirmative testimonies on many other lands.
Welcome to the Nostalgia Podcast with me, Sebastian Morello, and my friend Brian Scarffe. Hi, Brian.
It's great to be back.
I'm in a cabin at the end of my garden where I work with a pint of stout, a winter warmer, as it's called. So actually, I'm rather enjoying myself. Now, since we last spoke, I have had an incredible experience, a lunch with Roger Buck, once known as a kind of leading figure in the Findhorn New Age community in Scotland, and now a very important figure in the traditionalist Catholic movement in Ireland. So that was quite an experience. He's writing an afterword for my forthcoming book, Mysticism, Magic and Monasteries, to be published with Ozusti Press. But this was my first time actually meeting him in person.
Interesting. And I remember you mentioned a week or two ago when you met up with him that he was operating on different levels of consciousness. I wonder whether you could maybe give me a little bit more, flesh that out for me.
Yeah, well, I don't want to go into it too much, particularly because some of our more normie listeners might get the heebie-jeebies, but it was definitely a case of, in the Newmanian phrase, heart speaking onto heart. Roger and I spent probably 3.5 hours discussing all things Tombergian and esoteric and hermetic. And it's interesting. I'm hoping today that we're going to talk a little bit about the gods, small g gods. And that's very much the way that Roger Buck sees Tomberg. Tomberg said that he would speak to certain people and lead and guide certain people from beyond the grave. That in his divinized condition in the celestial spheres, he would interact with the world and become something of, in the Hellenistic sense, a daemon, and guide people here below. And this was very much what Roger Buck insisted had likely been going on with me for the last few years, really. Tomberg has become a major figure in my own theological understanding, in my own understanding of Christian mysticism. And what Roger was saying to me was that, and I won't be able to do justice to Roger Buck's analysis of Tomberg because he's dedicated decades of his life to studying Tomberg. He's read Meditations on the Tarot from cover to cover about 15 times. But what he says is that the more you get to understand the fundamental thought of Valentin Tomberg, the more you realise there are these two major sources to his thought. There's Rudolf Steiner and there's Joseph de Maistre. And in many respects, this is extremely odd because these are two thinkers who almost seem irreconcilable. Steiner believed that the West needed to undergo this radical transformation of consciousness, and that in order to do that, it largely needed to be emancipated from its kind of institutionalized ecclesiastical character. All the things that gave rise to the Gothic cathedrals and the great universities and all of those things are those things from which modern man needed to emancipate himself, and he needed to transcend those things so as to move into this new age of the transformation of consciousness among humankind. Whereas Maistre, if you like, thought the opposite. Maistre thought that it was precisely the arrival of modern man that had plunged humanity into an age of darkness and stupidity and spiritual corruption and sightlessness, and that actually what we needed to do was move out of the revolutionary paradigm and recover our ancient civilizational sources and then induct ourselves very, very deeply into them. And somehow Tomberg takes, in this kind of Hegelian way, these two conflicting theses about how to respond to the crisis of modernity, and he brings a synthesis out of them that is his great Hermetic thought. And, you know, after doing my own doctoral thesis largely on Joseph de Maistre, and spending 3 years of my life pretty much almost reading nothing but Maistre, I then, in that work, when it was eventually published as a monograph by Routledge as Conservatism and Grace, I ended the whole work with an extended quotation from, guess who, Valentin Tomberg, which was kind of unusual. And Buck kind of threw up his hands and said, well, of course you did, because Tomberg was leading the entire thing. He was leading all of your research. He was guiding you into these interests. He was helping you to uncover these ideas. Tomberg has been sitting with you in your study the whole time. In a very literal sense, he has been one of the gods walking among you and guiding you. So, you know, that was cool.
Interesting. And I think Steiner is interesting because he, in his suspicions of the old institutional forms of Christendom, he's exemplary for what the New Age is. It's incredibly suspicious of all of the old institutions that we've received from the medieval period, whilst at the same time very appreciative of many of the fruits of those institutions. And it's an interesting paradox. You won't find people anywhere else who are more committed to studying the mysteries of the Holy Grail, of the Arthurian romances, of the Black Madonnas, of mystics such as Hildegard of Bingen, at exactly the same time really struggling to understand the position of an institutional structure like the Roman Catholic Church as being a necessary form within which these things grew out of. And I suppose it's a very modern emergence of the age of the Holy Spirit, as Joachim of Fiore would have had. And there's so much there that I feel like I would like to rescue, finding a way of bringing together a restoration of the institutional, formal character of human society as being something that is a step away from pure substance towards form, but at the same time, the living rescue the living vital growths that the New Age have held on to.
The trouble is, it is a very typical and recurrent trope within New Age movements that say the ancient apostolic churches, whether they be the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, the church that has a genuine and authentic apostolic succession, that this ecclesiastical structure is both the treasury of ancient wisdom, the treasury of great knowledge, but also has in some weird, perverse way, for the sake of power, has hidden the ancient truths of the great wisdom traditions, including its own wisdom tradition, from the hoi polloi, from the rabble, and that actually this is our inheritance, and somehow through esoteric means we need to reaccess it. And this is a very modern view, which obviously leads to a very negative view of the ecclesiastical structure and its role in not only the creation in a temporal sense of or the creation of human civilization, but also in the personal redemption of its members. And at the same time, whilst I'm deeply suspicious of such an account for obvious reasons, there are reasons also to be sympathetic to it, because we have actually watched as the church has grown ever more alien to herself, to her own spirituality, and it's conceded so much moral territory and intellectual territory to the prejudices of modernity that the church now finds it almost impossible to transmit her own tradition. So in a way, we've all ended up doing the very thing that the New Age has always told us we had to do, which is kind of access this stuff through esoteric means and reading ancient books and re-establishing in our own spiritual lives the ancient spiritual practices that have since completely gone out of fashion since the church started preaching this weird self-affirmation therapeutic religion that has very little to do with the ancient with its ancient mission of conveying the gospel and being the means by which man is flooded with grace.
I think it's really interesting that this tension between these two aspects of religion are there right from the very start at the beginning of the incarnation. The two groups of people who come to visit the infant Christ are the shepherds and the magi. And the shepherds, it is to them that Christ gives the governance structure over his new people, over the people who have been baptized and brought into the kingdom. But it is the Persian mystics, the philosophers, the magi, who bring the gifts to the infant child, and those gifts hold knowledge of the future, knowledge of death, knowledge of rebirth, and all of these mystical symbols that would become integral to the inner heart of the church's teachings throughout the ages. And those two things are separate from the start.
Yeah, well, I would say that there are actually three groups who come to visit the incarnation. There are the shepherds, the people immersed in the world and its activities and its seasons, in transforming the land, making it a stable source of food and clothing, who are completely, if you like, their faces are stuck in the earth itself. But that's not to look down on that. That is where God is emanated, and that is the reality that participates in God. And you know, for someone like me whose life is so bound up with the countryside, you know, for me the landscape itself is theophanic. It is the realm in which God unfolds in a natural way, or through his emanated creation. And then there are these astrologer kings, these incredible, you know, these Zoroastrian royal priests who appear from the east, and they are the ones who bring with them the great ancient wisdom traditions of the common knowledge of ancient man that comes, and it's laid before, if you like, all of those intimations of the Logos that make up the ancient wisdom traditions are then laid before the Logos incarnate. And yes, I mean, they bring with them the means by which man has material flourishing, symbolized in gold, the means by which the incarnate Logos is going to transform man, namely through his death, and the transformation of all religiosity, namely in the incense that's burned in the temple. And so everything is laid there. But then there's a third group who come and worship the incarnate Logos and travel with these royal astrologers and with these shepherds of the landscape. And that third group is the gods, the angels, the choirs of angels come. And they gather around Jesus Christ, and so you have these three groups, all of which I think are totally pertinent, well, to the kind of interests that you and I have, at least.
Yes, certainly. But perhaps unpick what you mean by angels and what you mean by gods, and are there areas where they don't overlap?
This is an extremely complicated area. Saint Augustine says that angel does not name the being, it names the operation. So angel simply means messenger.
Which is why in the Old Testament sometimes theophanies of God himself are called angels of the Lord, which can be confusing if you believe that it's a noun.
Yeah, and very often the what we now call angels are called by other roles, right? Like the thrones and dominions. What are the thrones and dominions? Well, they are the angels or the spirits or the small g gods of the nations and of political powers, for example. So these spiritual beings are often named in the scriptures according to their operation or function, rather than what the being in question is that's being discussed. Because the being is simply a spirit. It's a spirit. So if you believe in the scriptural testimony that there are angels, then really what you're saying is there are spirits who have particular functions, one of those functions being messengers of God. In any case, what that means is that the universe that we inhabit is also pregnant with spirits. And if we're to believe the scriptures, it's innumerable spirits, incalculable numbers of spirits. And the spirits walk among us, and the spirits are on almost every page of the scriptures. They play a central role in the ministry of Jesus Christ, even to the point of coming and comforting him and consoling him and ministering to him in the Garden of Gethsemane before his passion. They appear at his tomb after his resurrection. They two spirits appear among the disciples at the moment of the ascension. The angels are constantly involved in the ministry activity and redemptive work of Jesus Christ, and they're meant to play a very central role in Christian spirituality. Now, again, because of rationalism and materialism and the degree to which these hexas of modernity have colonized the mind, angels play a smaller and smaller role within Christian spirituality. But they used to play a major role. And by the way, one of the ways by which these spirits, or as the Psalms say, let's remember that the Psalms refer to God repeatedly as the God of gods. And in fact, St. Paul refers to even Satan as the god of this world, right? So these are the gods. Even the ancient Greeks, in Nordic religion, for example, the gods are not creator gods in the sense of being whose essence is existence, right? Every single one of these mythologies has a story of how these beings came about at a particular moment in time. These are not creator gods, these are created gods in the same sense as the angels.
Their qualities. So some great quality of the cosmos has a personal face. That is what's being referred to. And this is why, for example, Thor has his lightning and thunder. Poseidon is the god of the sea. They're associated with some kind of archetypal quality.
Exactly so, and also so do the gods in Hinduism. They operate. They have exactly the same role within that great mythology. And in fact, I remember when I was 19 years old, when I was going to the top of Mount Langtang I was living as a sort of bum out there in the Himalayas, and I met people who were in their final stage of Hindu maturity. So in the traditionally, particularly Hindus of the Brahmin caste had these 4 stages of life. One was childhood, the next was apprenticeship, the third was providing for a family, and the fourth was preparing for death. It's actually an extremely rational approach to ordering your life. And we used to do something very similar in the West, by the way, which is why this invention of the 1950s, that teenagehood is a time of rebellion, that was never the view historically. It's an invention of the last half century. It was always believed in the West that teenagehood was the period of particularly a man's life in which he took on responsibilities. He moved from being a child to taking on responsibilities. It was a time of apprenticeship for becoming a man and a provider. And then when you've done that, you need to start taking your spiritual life very, very seriously, and people would go on retreats and all kinds of things to prepare for death. And of course, in the Middle Ages, many men and women in the latter half of their marriages would agree together that one would enter a monastery and the other a convent, for example, in order to prepare. This is a very rational way of approaching your life. Anyway, that's a side point. I met many Brahmins up in the Himalayas who were there to meet the gods, particularly Shiva and his various manifestations, because Shiva is the god who is believed to, well, he's probably the most loved god in India. And whilst that might seem confusing to us because he's the god of destruction, by being the god of destruction, he's also the god of renewal and regeneration. And he's believed to reside in the Himalayas, in the mountains there, and he manifests himself in different ways there. And I met many Brahmins who had been businessmen, all sorts of things all over India. And then now in their 70s, 80s, they were travelling up into the mountains, and they would meditate in the glades and in the valleys. And they would go into the hot springs, and they would carry out spiritual practices there. And they were essentially there in order to commune with the gods, right? I think they were.
Contrast that with the normative old age experience in Christian civilization, which is to go into an old people's home and be entertained to death
by television.
Exactly, television, the most trivial entertainment programs, outsiders coming in and doing songs, maybe an occasional dance. Anything to stop you thinking about your imminent demise. It's really, it's not just that we've lost the great tradition of doing something similar in the West, is we've replaced it with something so profoundly awful that it's really horrifying to think about, even from a purely secular perspective. The reputations of these institutions are it's hard to think of something that has a lower reputation for how it treats these vessels of wisdom, as most traditional societies would have treated the older generations. So something to draw endless learning and knowledge about how to arrange society, how to have flourishing families. Well, what we've done is put them into nursery homes where they can be distracted in the most trivially terrifying ways, and we can forget about them as well.
Yeah, earlier when talking about the traditional Hindu approach to death, I called it an extremely rational way of ordering one's life. If you wanted to find the most irrational way of dealing with one's own finitude, you've just named it, right? That really is the most irrational way. And interestingly enough, whilst the elders in any traditional community were generally treasured as sources of civilizational wisdom in the way you alluded to, even when they're not, even when they're just old, stupid people, because, really stupid and often nasty people, when they get old, are still old and stupid and nasty. Or even let's say they just, as the saying goes, lose their marbles, right? The fact is that traditional societies have always held that it's good for us, it's good for younger people to actually live as if we are purified by expressing gratitude to older generations, because in some way we've received from them.
I was going to say this links back quite well to our original purpose, the question of the gods, because it's both in very old people and very young people. You find human persons who live closest to the veil of death, and as such are the most likely to have visitations of some kind, of a supernatural kind, or to encounter beings that are not purely material in the way that we would understand animals or other people. And by putting them, both old people and children, putting them in institutions and hiding them from an organic social arrangement, we've hidden away the ends of our society which are most porous to communication, interaction with worlds that are enchanted.
Yes, and that's why the Christian religion has always insisted that spiritual transformation comes about through a pathway of going from being childish to childlike. But you don't, whatever stage of spiritual transformation one subsists in, it's always centered in an awareness of the absolute immanence of the divine presence among us, including how that divine presence is emanated through his gods, right? Now, just to go back to the various ways by which the gods might be encountered, we can pray to the gods. Most Catholic Christians, for example, will learn as children the guardian angel prayer and say it before bed or first thing in the morning. We can pray to the gods. We can ask the gods for guidance. In a hagiography from the 19th century of the English saint Saint Neot, it says that in the glades and the groves where he prayed and chanted the psalms and offered the holy mass, angels would come and reside there because they loved the sacred atmosphere of the places where he would pray and offer sacrifices. And so the gods also attach themselves to very specific geographical territories. We know that there are gods of particular nations, even particular dioceses. So there are these gods that attach themselves to particular territories, but even gods can be, as Saint Neot did, gods can be called down into particular locations and reside there because those places have become sacred to God. And when I think I told you before, when I go walking with my dog in the woods, or out here in the countryside, as we discussed last time, I see so much of the English countryside as being sacred territory. I ask the gods for permission to trespass, to move onto their pathways and into their sacred glades, because the gods are present all over the place, and it's a mentality like that that starts to connect the notion of gods from a theological perspective with the folkloric notion of the presence of fairies, nymphs, elves, and all of that whole tradition of seeing spirits constantly among us, whom we must acknowledge with a degree of fear and trepidation.
So, in the medieval period, there was a fair amount of speculation as to what elves, fairies, and gnomes and other quasi-subtle beings were. Were they demons? Were they angels? At least one significant text left behind from the Middle Ages speculated that there could have been a third group of angels which didn't rebel against God, but also didn't take sides with the light, and ended up in a kind of neutral position, not under the earth, but on the earth, rejected from heaven. That was one alternate possibility. More recently, there has been speculation among some Christian mystics that there is, just as we look up to the angels and higher spiritual beings as being lowercase g God or godlike, so that there is a lesser spiritual fauna which inhabits the natural world, which looks up to us as being godlike, and our behaviours and habits and societies inform them, just as the angelic powers inform us. There's such a range of speculations. My personal position is that we shouldn't simplify the question by trying to look for any one source or solution to what is a very highly strange problem and issue. And I suspect that what we're dealing with is a habitat vastly more varied than the natural animal world. So just as there are higher animals such as primates and lower animals such as invertebrates and fish and birds, the spiritual world is just as varied, and not everything fits into a simple angel-demon dichotomy.
Well, I agree with you, in part at least. What I would say about this is that this is very complicated. What Aquinas says about the angels is that given that every nature or species is individuated into its given members by its material principle, every angel, by virtue of not having a material principle, but by being a spirit that is conjoined to an act of existence directly by God, every angel must itself be its own nature, which means that every single angel is as different from one another, or different from the next angel or every other angel as, we are from dogs, right, or from cats or whatever. Now, so that means that you're dealing with a particular set of beings for whom genus and species they're not really appropriate. You're just dealing with this kind of almost infinite number of creatures, all of which are radically different from one another. And that's why I think the traditional folkloric conception of the way in which spirits are present among us and how they interact with us might in fact be much closer to the way that these spirits actually are than, say, the strict theological definition of that I've just given of individual spirits conjoined to an act of existence. Yeah, what are these characters like? What are their personalities? How do they behave? What we do know is that in the folklore traditions, these creatures need to be approached with fear that they are dangerous. They're often dangerous. They're extremely powerful. Their wrath can be stoked very easily. And it's quite interesting that, for example, in the Islamic tradition, you have jinns or genies. My wife was telling me that in Romania you have iele, these kind of seductive female spirits who will approach men who are walking alone at night, or who are trespassing on their territory,
which is an extremely common theme worldwide, right?
Well, so the Irish have, of course, the same thing. I forget the name of their fairy that behaves in this way. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, of course, witches do the same thing. In all of these traditions, you have these spirits that are feminine or female in some way, that will appear to men who might be easily tempted, and will try and seduce them. And if the men are seduced, then they will take possession of them. And if they refuse, then they will hex those men, and they will curse those men. And of course, these spiritual beings who behave in this way have an analogue in Catholic demonology, namely in the succubi and the incubi, these sexual angels who try to seduce people and then try to take possession of them, or try to afflict them, or try to curse them, and this is something that just reoccurs all over the place.
So I think we should backtrack a tiny bit and mention that there's a metaphysical layer of reality which traditional societies and theology recognized, which has at various times been called the subtle realm or the astral realm, and it has a material existence, but it's not base matter in the way that our material world is. And when we dream, or we have trance-like experiences, hypnotic experiences, the conscious parts of our being enter more deeply into that realm, which is a realm deeply entangled with consciousness. So it has a kind of physicality, but it's more powerfully woven by conscious themes than our world is. Something more akin to what people describe when they talk of idealism as a structure of reality. And so when people encounter fairies or elves or succubi, the descriptions almost always have a very dreamlike quality, but at the same time appear to have physical artifacts. So people's clothes go missing, people disappear from one place and appear in another place, or people go missing for days or weeks at a time, but often believing that they've only gone for 5 to 10 minutes. And it doesn't quite fit into any kind of materialistic conception of having an ecstatic vision or some kind of psychotic break, because it does leave physical evidence of some kind. And so I think that that's an area of Aquinas's angelology which is a little bit, at least perhaps you can correct me, I don't believe he dealt with beings that had a kind of subtle materiality.
Well, I mean, there are a number of things to say there. Obviously, I don't really like the phrase base matter to refer to the world in which we reside, because the matter with which we're surrounded, insofar as it's animate because it has this life that's being held in being by the Godhead at all times, and insofar as it's not animate, it is still composed of essence and existence, and therefore granted intelligibility by emanating forth from the mind of God and existing insofar as it participates in the act of God. So I don't really believe in base matter. I think everything with which we're surrounded is completely purposive and meaning driven.
So just to clarify, when I mean, I am referring to the idea that as part of the fall, the original fall, that there was a physical change in the cosmos as grace, as we stepped away from the life of grace, which removed some of the natural vibrancy or even the connection to the supernatural that was inherent in the world, and death being introduced was what's meant by falling into a less subtle realm, a realm which is closer to non-existence and death, which I do think that the tradition allows for. So someone like Scotus Erigina spoke a lot about it.
No, sure, but not discounting that, it has always been accepted that the angels, as spiritual beings, can act on matter. Now, they do it through a kind of quasi-hylomorphic way, right? In the same way as traditionally the kind of scholastic explanation for the fires of hell, for example, how can temporal fires injure spiritual souls? Well, they're conjoined hylomorphically. And in a similar way, angels or spirits, in either their grace-filled or fallen state, in the case of demons, can act on matter. They can act on our imaginations, but they can act on matter in a much more dramatic, observable sense as well. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the way by which angels are encountered very often in the scriptures, and the way by which Christians traditionally encountered the angels, was through wandering in the dream world, which I think is this kind of access to this subtle plane that you're describing. It's the normative access to the subtle plane, as it were, and wandering in the dream world, which is how Saint Joseph, for example, encounters a spirit who directs him to flee to Egypt. Wandering in the dream world is an essential part of religiosity in the scriptures, and it was a major part of Christian spirituality, particularly in the early centuries. And the early Christians around the Mediterranean inherited this practice of incubation from the theurgical masters of ancient Greece, and they baptized it, so that after their liturgies they would go into these deep dream states, and they would commune with the gods, and they would commune with the martyrs and with the great saints and so forth. Now, this is, when you talk about this with most Christians today, they think that you are mad, or at least proposing something that is completely alien to Christian spirituality. Well, it wasn't always thus. And you and I have a particular affection for Abbot Trithemius, Johannes Trithemius, who sought to bring back spiritual practices centered on wandering in the dream world, precisely so as to personally commune with those gods or those spirits who are leading us and helping us, especially our
This
sacred guardian angels.
he's not the lone voice in the post-medieval period pointing to this as a Christian practice. There was also the Abbé Julio, a French bishop of the 19th century, very much an Orthodox bishop, although later in life he was convinced to join the Gallican Church. It didn't affect the broader orthodoxy of his teachings, and he was deeply engaged in promoting incubation as a way of communing with angels and as a practice for healing as well. I was also made aware by a friend of mine that there was a very strong practice of incubation near holy wells in this country, particularly in places like Cornwall, where people would go to sleep near a holy well and receive dreams and healing, something which is still done very occasionally by people who have an interest in the old practice of Celtic spirituality, let's say. And I don't mean that in the charged anti-Catholic sense.
No, sure. I mean, Paul Kingsnorth has written about how he has travelled to some of the sacred places of the Celtic saints in Ireland, particularly caves where great Celtic saints lived as hermits, and he's slept there for the night in order to draw close to God through the gods, as it were. Yes, this practice was very common. Interestingly enough, not that long ago, I was in Trondheim in Norway, and I met with the Bishop of Trondheim, Bishop Erik Varden, who was, before he was bishop, he was an abbot of a Trappist monastery in England. And I asked him what his opinion was of Christian incubation as a spiritual practice. And he gave a very interesting answer. He said, well, what do you think the monastery guest house is for? The whole point of the monastery guest house is so that people can come from the hustle and bustle of the world, and they can they can enter a place that has been rendered sacred by the sacrifice of the Holy Mass and the chanting of the Psalms, which are kind of, I know it might seem impious to speak like this, but the Psalms are kind of magical spells, right? They are part of the
holy magic.
It's holy magic. It's theurgy, right? To chant the Psalms in this way. And very strange things happen, by the way, when you chant the Psalms. Things happen in your life. Transformative things happen. The angels get close to you when you chant the Psalms. This is essentially what Bishop Varden was saying. He was saying that these monasteries are sacred places where angels love to live, and if you go there and you sleep, then the angels, the spirits, the gods come and visit you in the night, and you commune with them, and you draw close to God through his divinized beings who walk among us. And interestingly, I mean, he would have been reluctant to put it quite in those terms, but he was saying that the practice of incubation is the very purpose of the monastery guest house. And he said to me, and any seasoned guest master in any monastery will tell you that when people come to monasteries and they sleep there, strange things happen in their dreams, right? Amazing things happen in their dreams.
It's interesting to think that historically, at the very pinnacle of the monastic practice in Europe, we had the Laus Perennis, the unending praise in a number of monasteries, such as Bangor in Ireland and Old Sarum. I believe there was one, possibly also at Glastonbury. Obviously, the very famous one was at Cluny in France, where monks would chant the psalms without end. And in some of these places, there would be up to 100 monks tag teaming on and off from a group of over 2,000 monks. At any one time, at least 100 of them would be chanting the psalms without end, every hour of the day, 24 hours a day, every day of the week, every week of the year, for hundreds of years without end. And to think what that did not only to the civilization around them, but to the very earth underneath, to the subtle beings that we're talking about. I think that this has left an incredible legacy in the subtle world which Europe has around it, a kind of bank of spiritual power which continues to be drawn from even after the fall of spirituality among men on the continent. And perhaps one of the things that's holding back the sort of final apocalyptic chaos which should arrive when the church withdraws from its proper function in society.
Well, indeed, it seems to me that we have done so much violence to the miracle that was Christendom, particularly over the last few centuries, that the whole thing should have been obliterated off the face of the planet. And I'm quite certain that the only reason why we're still going as a civilization, even if just a shadow of a civilization, is largely because this sacral continent is covered in angels. It's covered in cathedrals full of angels, and I think it's Rupert Sheldrake who talks about being in a cathedral and with somebody who claimed that she could see angels. And she said the whole cathedral is full of angels. And he said to her, well, what do they look like? And she said they look depressed because they're unemployed, which I thought was quite an interesting story.
I've always been very moved by the Venerable Bede. He wrote that he was always afraid to be even a minute late to any of the offices, lest the angels noticed that he wasn't there. And he had such a deep relationship with the angelic realm that he felt shame at the idea, not that any of his brother monks would notice that he hadn't made it, but that the angels themselves would see that the song had started without him. I've always found that deeply inspiring.
So you see, I think we need to recover some of these remarkable practices that we had down the ages. One of the problems with Western religion is that we haven't taken activities that are themselves temporal and mundane and made them pathways of religious transformation in the way that other civilizations have. I mean, obviously you have yoga in India. I've always been amazed at the way that the Japanese have turned almost any activity, whether that's archery or tea making or flower arrangement or whatever, into a pathway of spiritual transformation. Last night I drove into London to pick up this. I'm going to show you this. This is my new mace that I exercise with. Hold on. Oh, look at that. Can you see
wow,
that?
Gosh, incredible.
It's incredible. It's a handmade Indian Garda for exercising. And I tell you what, when you're swinging this thing around your body, it's doing all those wonderful things like building up stabilizing muscles and all the things that you need for someone who has a bad back like me. But it also puts you into what an increasing number of neuroscientists and psychologists and philosophers are talking about, namely the flow state, as it were, because if you get it wrong and this swings into you, you're not going to get up. So this is And when you're in the so-called flow state, that is to say, when you're attending to your activity with an attention that is fully embodied but very intense, you seem to kind of, you transcend the monkey brain, so to speak, the constant chattering, and you suddenly become fully alive. It's like a bit like the spirit, the practice of mindfulness, but with the sacramentality put back into it, so as to so that it becomes the sacrament of the present moment. I often do my Garda exercises listening to chant, and essentially I allow this activity to throw me into a, I suppose, a kind of cosmic dance, and I'm moving with the universe, I'm moving with the cosmos, and you tap into something that is, if you like, the true reality. It's the hyper reality. It's the way things actually are. And I think that we need to. There's a great work to be done to rediscover the activities by which we apprehend things as they truly are.
Well, what you talk about when you speak of the flow state, it's the harmonization of the interior spheres. If man is a microcosm and the cosmos has harmonic spheres, then when man brings his interior spheres into a harmonic relationship with each other, he is beginning to embody what the cosmos should be. And it's particularly interesting, these musical allegories that we use they're not just strange, almost new age sounding images to be brought to the Christian table. They're very much in scripture. If you read the stories of David and King Saul becomes possessed at various times by some nefarious god. David is threatened. His life becomes threatened. The king begins to throw deadly weapons at him. And what does David do? David takes out his harp and plays a tune, and it exorcises the king. The confrontation with the deep magic of music sends away the evil spirit from Saul. And that's not only in the Christian tradition. This is true in the ancient Orphic tradition. The perennial wisdom, the Pythagorean wisdom, tells us that it's true music that exercises the cosmos. And it's no coincidence that people speculate that Gregorian chant is a distant child of an ancient Pythagorean chant, which happened in the depths of philosophical history. And it's also no coincidence that there are legends of unending chant going on this island before Christianity, before the incarnation of Christ, that the endless praise of the monks wasn't a novelty. It was a continuation of an even older tradition, just fully infused with grace.
Well, I just got back from Hungary, and when you are there, and that really is a remarkable country, and I spent quite a bit of time in the west of the country, and you look across the landscape and you see where all the chanting that you're describing went on. You see the spires coming out across the landscape, in the hills, down in the valleys. The churches dot the entire place. You're really in the heart of old Holy Roman Imperial Europe, old Mittel Europa. And I'm very impressed by what's going on in Hungary. I've done work with the Hungarians in government there, with their various projects, and I'm very impressed by what's going on in terms of their pro-natalist policies, and obviously their promotion of my my former mentor and supervisor, Roger Scruton. But I can't help but feel that even part of their reason for promoting Roger Scruton, who, if you like, saw himself as promoting a very English kind of conservatism, so it's not immediately obvious why they would adopt him as their kind of main intellectual guide, other than the fact that Viktor Orban was an underground student of his during the time of the Iron Curtain. But I worry that one of the reasons why they've adopted Roger Scruton as a key figure is because they see him as a possible candidate for creating something like a secular conservatism in Hungary and for its future. And for the reasons that we've been talking about, because I think that we live in a world where the gods reside and that we have to take their presence very, very seriously, I think anything like a secular conservatism is doomed from the outset, essentially. And I also think that the best thing that a political presence can do is develop piety to the God of that nation, who has this role to guide it and father it in the great providential schema of our world.
Interesting. The what immediately springs to mind is I do a little bit of work with the monks of Norcia in Italy, in Umbria, and they've recently built an incredibly impressive monastery, practically from the ground up on a late medieval, early modern ruin, Franciscan friary. And it was actually the Hungarians, which were one of the chief sponsors of the project. They gave relics of St. Stephen. There's a chapel of St. Stephen at the monastery. So a mutual acquaintance of ours, Edward Habsburg, was there at the recent 25-year celebrations. And so it seems that the Hungarians have both of these options before them. And I wonder whether, as they bring in Western intellectuals such as yourself, how much influence can people like you have to push them, especially you, because of your expertise in Roger Scruton? How much do you feel it would be possible for you to push them away from that secularized view of conservatism?
Well, perhaps part of the role, and I'm heartened to hear what you say about their patronage of the monastery at Norcia. I expect Archduke Edward von Habsburg had rather a lot to do with that. He being the Hungarian ambassador to the Holy See. But in any case, one of the things that I am trying to convince people of is that a secularist reading of Roger Scruton is a mistaken one, and that was, at least in large part, the point of my book Conservatism and Grace, that was published in 2023, I think, to show that actually Roger Scruton's entire practical schema is inexplicable and doesn't really make any sense without taking seriously the religious undergirding of his project, which he explores in detail in works like On Human Nature, The Face of God, The Soul of the World, and so forth. And as I've said to you in the past, and it's not purely being provocative, Roger Scruton was much closer to the traditionalist, perennialist thinkers than people actually realise. One of my first ever conversations with Roger Scruton was back when I was doing an MA with him, before we even started on doctoral research, was all about the the kind of fatalistic determinism of the Bhagavad Gita, and he was it was a text he was very familiar with, and we discussed it at length. And when you read his later works, you see that he is drawing from all of the great wisdom traditions all of the time, because he thinks that they are genuine sources of personal and civilizational transformation. Now, interestingly enough, he doesn't think that you should read all of these texts so as to transcend them and see them all from a bird's eye point of view, and then come up with something synthetic of your own making for your own spiritual transformation, as some of them did think that. The kind of people from Madame Blavatsky to Kathleen Raine, fell into that trap, but much more in the traditionalist, perennialist vein of someone like Guénon. He thought that you could only know the perennial truths articulated in all the great wisdom traditions, not by transcending those traditions, but by inducting yourself as deeply as possible as you can into one of them. And of course, for Roger, that was Christianity in its Anglican form.
Which is interesting, because reading his works, it's always ambiguous as to how much he actually believes in the more supernatural elements of Anglicanism, or the traditional Christianity that Anglicanism should have a claim to.
Yes, I'm pretty sure he thought that Anglicanism was not the best articulation of these perennial truths, but it was the one available to him, as it were, in a wonderful old church in Gloucestershire or Wiltshire. But nonetheless, the point is, he still believes in this deposit of wisdom into which he has to induct himself, and he has to do it also through practices. But that was his main view, interestingly enough. In his book on Our Church, he says that, as he understands it, Christianity is not primarily a collection of propositions. It's a set of practices by which one becomes a member of a religious community. So, and this is much closer to the kind of way that we've been talking about these things. But I would say that actually probably the question of Roger Scruton's religiosity and the degree to which it's aligned with perennialism and traditionalism could be a really interesting discussion for a future episode. So perhaps we should park this for now and take it up next time.
I think one final thing that occurred to me when we were talking about unending praise and the effects of the monasteries, I may have said this to you before, but I believe that one fundamental element of properly re-evangelizing our society would be to institute the unending praise again. And it occurred to me that something similar to this happened a few years ago in the Asbury revival in America, where an evangelical service ended with sort of fairly standard praise and worship, but it went on without any pause for nearly 16 days.
Yeah.
And it was an enormous religious event. It drew in thousands of people from all over the world. It generated an enormous amount of media coverage. Now, I don't think that that's exactly what I want to see, but it's beginning to reveal the power of mystical music over a 24-hour period, over a week's period, without a break. The spiritual power of that event, it still has huge repercussions in the evangelical segment of Protestantism. So how much more powerful would an evangelical event based on the Gregorian chant of the Psalms be?
Well, I did see that at the time, I remember watching videos of it. I must confess that having watched the kind of prayer so-called, and listen to the kind of music, I'm perhaps a little more suspicious of the entire event than you are. But in any case, I can certainly agree that the need for an experiential, transformative encounter with the immanence of the divine presence, particularly through the many spirits with which God reigns over his created order, is the fundamental prerequisite for a great Christian renewal.